Will you believe everything you knew about reality are lies if shattered by a series of inexplicable encounters? The Thunderbird wasn't supposed to exist. I'd staked my entire career on that certainty, built my reputation dismantling the myths that others clung to so desperately. 15 years I spent traversing Montana's wilderness, armed with thermal cameras and scientific instruments, explaining away every unexplained light, every mysterious footprint, every supposed cryptid sighting. I was good at it too, the rational voice of science, cutting through superstition like a knife through fog. But that night in the Bitterroot Mountains changed everything. The night when all my carefully constructed explanations crumbled like ancient bones beneath my feet. I still remember checking my instruments obsessively as the atmosphere grew heavy with something more than just storm pressure. The way my calibrated equipment began displaying readings that defied every natural law I'd built my understanding upon. You have to understand, I wasn't some amateur ghost hunter or thrill-seeking cryptid chaser. I held 3 degrees in biological sciences. I'd published peer-reviewed papers debunking everything from Bigfoot to skinwalkers. My laptop was filled with perfectly reasonable explanations for every supposed supernatural encounter in the state's history. I was the person other scientists called when they needed hard evidence to counter local legends. That's what makes this so much harder to share. Because what happened that moonless night, when the sky itself seemed to tear open like wet paper, it broke something in my understanding of reality, something that can never be repaired. I became the very thing I used to mock with such intellectual superiority, a witness. A trembling voice in the dark insisting that the impossible was real. What I'm about to share isn't just another creepypasta or internet legend. It's not some campfire story designed to make you check the shadows before sleep. This is my confession, my warning. And perhaps, given what I've learned about those who've shared similar stories before me, my last testament. Because knowledge, true knowledge, comes with a price. And the entities that ruled this land long before us, they don't take kindly to being rediscovered. But before I tell you what I saw in those ancient mountains, you need to understand how it all began. How a lifetime of certainty unraveled in a single week. And why even now I find myself checking the sky during thunderstorms, hoping against hope that the dark shape I sometimes glimpse between lightning flashes is just my imagination trying to process trauma. Because the alternative, that it's still out there, watching, waiting. That thought keeps me awake most nights. That thought and the growing certainty that it's not just watching me anymore, it's watching us all. National Geographic, Discovery Channel, History Channel, I'd worked with them all, becoming their go-to expert for debunking cryptid sightings across the American Northwest. The science behind the myth was my monthly column in Empirical Truth magazine, where I'd systematically dismantled every major cryptozoological claim of the past decade. My editor used to joke that I was single-handedly destroying the mystery left in the world. I took that as a compliment. The assignment came in on March 15, 2024. A surge of Thunderbird sightings near the Blackfeet Reservation had caught national attention. Not your typical blurry photos or distant speculation. These were detailed accounts from ranch owners, wildlife biologists, even a retired Air Force pilot. The magazine wanted my usual thorough debunking, complete with scientific analysis and rational explanations. I remember smirking as I packed my equipment, already drafting the conclusion in my head. The first interview changed everything. Sarah Blackwolf, PhD in atmospheric sciences from MIT, described with clinical precision how she watched a creature with a wingspan wider than a small passenger plane create localized storm systems by beating its wings. Her instruments had recorded electromagnetic anomalies that defied known atmospheric physics. Her hands trembled as she showed me the data, but her eyes never wavered. She wasn't seeking publicity or fame. She was terrified of being believed. Then I learned about David Chen, my predecessor on this investigation. Another skeptic, even more decorated than myself. He'd started looking into the sightings 3 weeks before I took the case. His last phone call to our editor was a frantic mess of scientific terminology and fragmented warnings about them knowing he knew. The police found his car at a trailhead near Two Medicine Lake, but no other traces. I told myself it was all coincidence when I found his campsite last Thursday. The logical part of my brain worked overtime, cataloguing explanations as I photographed the scene. But there's no scientific explanation for what I saw. His cameras, laptop and satellite phone weren't just damaged, they were melted from the inside out, as if some impossible heat had liquefied their components while leaving the outer casings almost untouched. The metal had flowed and reformed into patterns that reminded me of ancient petroglyphs I'd once studied, patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. What truly shook me, though, was his journal. The first entries were filled with the same academic skepticism I prided myself on. Methodical observations, rational hypotheses, scientific reasoning. But the handwriting changed over those final pages, becoming increasingly erratic. The last entry simply repeated one phrase over and over. The wings block the stars. The wings block the stars. The wings. I should have walked away then. Should have fabricated some reasonable explanation and left the mountains to their secrets. But 15 years of scientific arrogance doesn't evaporate in a single moment of doubt. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I dug deeper. And in doing so, I began to unravel threads that should have remained tightly bound, leading me toward a truth that no human was meant to comprehend. The pictographs were hidden in a cave system that wasn't marked on any modern map. I found them while tracking an unusual electromagnetic signature that kept disrupting my instruments. The images were unlike anything I'd seen in my years of research. Not crude representations, but precise anatomical studies rendered in pigments that still seemed to shimmer with an inner light after countless centuries. They showed the Thunderbird not as Native American myth portrayed it, but as something far more ancient. Something that existed before human memory, with geometries that hurt my eyes to follow and anatomical features that defied biological classification. Joseph Running Bear, a Blackfeet elder, found me studying the cave walls. I expected the usual folkloric warnings, but what he shared chilled me to my core. He spoke of the time of return, not as legend, but as precise mathematical certainty. His people had been keeping records, he said, tracking cycles that stretched back before written history. The disappearances, the storms, the mass migrations of wildlife, they weren't random events. They were coordinates on a vast temporal map, counting down to something that made my scientific mind recoil. My equipment continued to malfunction in increasingly impossible ways. GPS coordinates shifted randomly, showing locations in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, or more disturbingly, places that didn't exist on any map. Digital compasses spun wildly, then stabilized, pointing to directions that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The readings from my atmospheric sensors described conditions that should have torn the mountain apart, yet the air remained preternaturally still. In the local historical society, I found death certificates and missing persons reports dating back to the earliest European settlements. Every 40 years, like clockwork, people vanished. Not just hikers or isolated travelers, but entire research teams. The patterns stretched beyond Montana. Similar disappearances occurred at precisely the same times across ancient sites worldwide. More disturbing were the photographs from different eras, showing the same impossible shadow crossing mountain ranges separated by continents and decades. Then came that first night in my tent, when sleep betrayed me into truth. I dreamed? No, experienced. A vision of wings that dwarfed the mountains themselves. They moved with a geometric precision that defied organic life, casting shadows that existed in dimensions I couldn't comprehend. The stars behind them didn't simply vanish. They ceased to exist in ways my mind couldn't process. I woke up with equations I'd never seen before, carved into my field notebook in my own handwriting, and a certainty that something vast and ancient had looked back at me through the thin veil of unconsciousness. The next morning, I called my editor to explain that the Thunderbird story needed to be shelved. But the number no longer worked. In fact, none of my contacts' numbers connected. Each call reached the same automated message. The temporal coordinates you are attempting to reach have been discontinued. That's when I realized I wasn't just investigating a story anymore. I had become part of a pattern that had been repeating since before humanity learned to count its fears. And the countdown Joseph spoke of, it wasn't warning of the Thunderbird's return. It was marking humanity's departure. The cattle mutilations began 3 days after I discovered the cave paintings. The Blackfoot Ranch lost 12 head of cattle in a single night, but it was the precision that defied explanation. Each carcass had been dissected with mathematical perfection, cuts that even laser surgery couldn't replicate. The wounds formed patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Local veterinarians refused to sign off on their reports. One simply wrote, "This is not possible," across his official documents and left town the next day. I discovered the first spiral tree on April 3rd, near the edge of the reservation. Its bark had been stripped in a perfect logarithmic spiral, the kind you find in the structure of galaxies. By the end of the week, we'd found 37 more, each displaying the same impossible pattern. The Forest Service botanist who examined them found growth rings that spiraled through the wood itself, as if the trees had grown that way from seedlings. Carbon dating placed their age at over 10,000 years, yet I had photographs of those same trees, unmarked, taken just days before. The animal suicides haunted me most. I watched through my binoculars as entire herds of elk, moving with synchronized precision, walked off the cliffs of Going to the Sun Mountain. No panic, no hesitation. Their movements had a ritualistic quality, forming geometric patterns in their final moments that I'd seen echoed in those ancient cave paintings. Park rangers found bears, wolves, and mountain lions following the same paths, their natural enmities forgotten in service to some greater calling we couldn't comprehend. Sarah Chen, the climatologist I mentioned earlier, found me at my campsite that evening. Her instruments had detected a weather pattern that violated every known law of atmospheric physics. Storms were forming impossible shapes, creating temperature inversions that shouldn't exist. She showed me satellite data of cloud formations moving against prevailing winds, arranging themselves into those same spiral patterns we'd seen in the trees. The raw data had begun writing itself into her computer in ancient Blackfeet syllabics, a language neither of us could read. Then came the morning of April 7th, when every bird within a 50-mile radius simply vanished. Not just local species, migratory birds altered their ancient routes, creating a perfect circle of empty sky centered on those mysterious caves. The silence was deafening. Even insects fell quiet, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The Audubon Society's monitoring stations registered infrasound vibrations at frequencies matching those found in deep-sea trenches, impossible readings for our elevation. I remember standing at my research station that evening, watching the empty sky, when Sarah grabbed my arm. Her eyes were fixed on her weather radar, where a pattern was emerging that made both of us question our sanity. The clouds were arranging themselves into what looked like an ancient text, spelling out words in a language that predated human writing. But it was the translation software's response that truly terrified us. It identified the language as pre-linguistic geometric proto-communication, the same patterns found encoded in the DNA of the earliest life forms on Earth. We realized then that we weren't observing separate phenomena. The cattle mutilations, the spiral trees, the mass animal deaths, they weren't warnings or omens. They were preparations. Nature itself was being rewritten, transformed into something that could survive what was coming. And those of us who noticed, we weren't meant to be observers. We were meant to be witnesses to something that had been waiting to return since before our species learned to walk upright. April 9th, 2024, 6:17 p.m. Mountain Time. That's when the impossible storm appeared on our radar. Sarah's equipment showed it moving northwest at 87 miles per hour, directly against Category 3 winds. The storm had a structure unlike anything recorded in meteorological history. A perfect spiral with mathematical proportions matching the golden ratio. The National Weather Service's automated systems crashed trying to classify it. The lightning came next. Not from the clouds, but from the Earth itself. Massive bolts of blue-white electricity shooting upward into the darkened sky. Each strike left crystalline structures in the ground, formations that resembled circuit boards, but followed patterns I'd seen in those ancient cave paintings. When we measured the electrical output, our instruments detected negative voltage, as if the lightning was being pulled up by something above the clouds, something that demanded more power than nature could provide. I found the first feather at the base of Looking Glass Mountain. It was larger than any known bird species could produce, nearly 6 feet long, with an internal structure that violated everything we know about aerodynamics. But what truly defied explanation was its behavior. The feather seemed to shift between states of matter, becoming transparent at regular intervals before solidifying again. When we finally managed to photograph it, the images showed it in multiple positions simultaneously, as if it existed in several dimensions at once. Within hours, it had disappeared completely, leaving only equations burned into the ground beneath it. The warnings appeared overnight, ancient Blackfeet phrases written in fresh blood across the rocks near our research station. Carbon dating would later show the blood itself was thousands of years old, yet somehow still liquid. More disturbing was the language analysis. The syntax suggested the warnings weren't written in modern times and translated to ancient Blackfeet, but rather the opposite. These were modern phrases written in an ancient language that had waited millennia to be relevant. Then came the night of April 10th, when the mountains found their voice. It began as a low-frequency hum, just at the edge of human hearing. Our seismic equipment registered it as a form of harmonic resonance, but the pattern was too precise, too structured to be natural. The peaks themselves were vibrating in perfect synchronization, creating a sound that seemed to reach directly into our primitive brains. Those of us who heard it understood something our ancestors had known. These mountains weren't just rock and stone. They were waiting. They were ready. They were heralds. Sarah recognized the harmonics first. They matched frequencies found in the oldest known musical instruments, predating human civilization. But there was something else, hidden in the subsonic registers. A message encoded in mathematics so advanced it made quantum physics look like simple arithmetic. The mountains weren't just singing, they were answering a call. I remember standing there, my scientific worldview crumbling around me as the storm above began to take shape. The clouds weren't just moving anymore. They were being sculpted by something that understood the atmosphere as intimately as an artist understands clay. And in those swirling patterns, I saw the truth that would drive me to the edge of sanity. We had never been alone on this planet. We had just been living in the calm between the beats of ancient wings. April 11th, 2024, 3:33 a.m. The time matters because it was the last moment my watch ever displayed. The shadow came first, not cast from above, but seeming to well up from the earth itself. It spread across Looking Glass Valley at impossible speeds, consuming distance in ways that defied perspective. I watched through my camera's viewfinder as it devoured mountains whole, not flowing around them, but passing through them, as if the ancient peaks were nothing more than momentary interruptions in something far more ancient and substantial. The eyes opened somewhere above the valley's center. To say they were eyes is to call the sun a candle. What I saw were windows into the birth of our world, swirling masses of creation and destruction that held the memory of when Earth was nothing but molten potential. They weren't looking at me, they were looking through me, through time itself, seeing every possible version of this moment across countless realities. My cameras melted, not from heat, but from the fundamental impossibility of capturing something that existed beyond the spectrum of human comprehension. The sound came next. Not a screech or a roar, but a frequency that seemed to vibrate the fabric of reality itself. Every electronic device within miles exploded simultaneously. I watched as waves of visible distortion rippled through the air, turning the familiar landscape into something that belonged in a twisted dream. Trees bent in geometrically impossible ways, their forms reflecting angles that shouldn't exist in our three-dimensional space. The ground beneath my feet became uncertain, shifting between states of matter with each pulse of that reality-bending sound. I ran. God help me, I ran. Through mountain trails that no longer followed the maps in my mind, past rocks that bled mathematics and trees that twisted themselves into signs from a language older than time. The stars above wheeled in new configurations, forming constellations that spoke of things my mind refused to process. The very air seemed alive with purpose, each breath filling my lungs with knowledge I was never meant to possess. That's when I found Joseph Running Bear, waiting at the ancient circle of stones. He'd known I would come, had known for decades. He said, reading the signs passed down through generations of his people. The ritual was older than his tribe, older than any human civilization. It wasn't meant to protect me from the Thunderbird, he explained, as he drew the symbols in a paste made from his own blood. It was meant to protect reality itself from what I had become by witnessing the truth. The price of the ritual was terrible in its simplicity. I would survive, but I would become a beacon for others like me. The ones who had seen too much, who knew what waited above the clouds and beyond the stars. We would find each other, Joseph said, drawn together by the weight of impossible knowledge, compelled to share our stories even as we prayed no one would believe them. As he completed the final symbol, I looked up one last time. What I saw wasn't a bird, wasn't even a creature in any sense we could understand. It was a living intersection of time and space, a being that existed in dimensions our science hadn't even theorized yet. And in that moment, as reality stabilized around me like cooling glass, I understood why every ancient culture had warnings about looking into the sky. Some things once seen can never be unseen. Some knowledge once gained becomes a door that can never be closed. I survived that night, if you can call it survival. But as I sit here sharing this with you, I can feel it watching. Not with those ancient eyes, but through the very probability waves of existence itself. And sometimes in my darker moments, I wonder if everything that happened was just its way of ensuring its story would be told. After all, what better way to prepare humanity for the impossible than to send its broken witnesses out into the world, compelled to share a truth that no one is ready to believe? Those 7 days in the cave system beneath Looking Glass Mountain changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. I initially fled there seeking refuge, my scientist's mind still desperately clinging to the notion that solid rock could protect me from something that existed beyond dimensional boundaries. The deeper I went, the more I realized I wasn't escaping. I was being guided. The cave walls held impossible hieroglyphs that seemed to shift and change as I passed them. Not ancient carvings, but living text that wrote itself into existence before my eyes. I saw myself there, rendered in symbols that predated human writing. Not just my presence in the cave, but every decision that had led me to this point. My career debunking myths, my arrogant certainty, even the exact expression of horror on my face as I read my own story written millions of years before my birth. I wasn't alone in those twisting passages. I found others, or what remained of them. Dr. Chen's predecessor from the National Weather Service, still clutching notebooks filled with equations that broke the laws of mathematics. A geological survey team from 1987, their equipment fused into sculptures that hurt my eyes to look at. All of them had been led here, their stories carved into the walls like chapters in some cosmic library. Some had survived, leaving behind journals that read like prophecies of my own experience. Others, their remains told stories of transformations that defied biological possibility. That's when the truth hit me. The Thunderbird wasn't hunting us at all. Every twist and turn in the caves led deeper, following a spiral pattern I recognized from those first tree markings. We weren't prey being chased down. We were cells being drawn toward the heart of something vast and purposeful. Each of us had been chosen, our very skepticism and scientific knowledge making us perfect witnesses for what waited at the center. On the 7th day, I reached the core chamber. What I found there still burns in my mind like a brand. A perfect sphere of empty space, impossibly carved from the living rock, its walls covered in mathematical proofs that unified quantum mechanics with gravity, that explained consciousness as a fundamental force of reality. At its center stood a crystalline formation that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human minds can process. And within it I saw everything. The Thunderbird wasn't a creature. It was an interface between realities, a guardian of thresholds that humanity was never supposed to cross. Those of us who had been drawn here weren't meant to die or survive. We were meant to understand. Each of us had spent our lives championing rational science, defying ancient wisdom. And each of us in this chamber became unwilling prophets of a truth too vast for any single mind to contain. I spent hours or maybe centuries in that chamber, watching the crystalline structure unfold secrets about the nature of existence. I saw why the native peoples had built their legends around fragments of a truth their minds couldn't fully grasp. I understood why every culture on Earth had stories of great birds that brought storms and change. They weren't trying to explain the thunder. They were trying to warn us about what waited behind it. When I finally emerged from the caves, I was no longer the same person who had entered. The hieroglyphs had become part of me, burning themselves into my dreams, rearranging my thoughts into patterns that echoed their impossible geometry. I hadn't just discovered something in the heart of that mountain. I'd become part of a story that had been writing itself since before our species took its first breath. And now, like every survivor before me, I carry its message in my bones, compelled to share a truth that exists beyond the boundaries of human comprehension. The truth about the Thunderbird stripped away the last remnants of my scientific worldview like bark peeling from those spiral-marked trees. It was never a creature, never a cryptid to be studied or catalogued. What we've been seeing, what every ancient culture tried to warn us about, is nothing less than reality's immune system. The Thunderbird exists to maintain the barriers between dimensions, to prevent the collapse of what we naively call natural law. I found the government files hidden in databases that shouldn't exist, accessible only through the mathematical equations burned into my mind from the cave system. Project Skyward, established in 1947, not to hide evidence of the Thunderbird, but to prevent humanity from understanding its true purpose. They knew. They'd always known. Every major scientific breakthrough of the past century was carefully measured, regulated not by human agencies, but by something far more ancient and vigilant. The pattern emerged with horrifying clarity. Every documented Thunderbird sighting throughout history preceded what we thought were natural disasters. The Black Death, the Great Fire of London, the San Francisco earthquake. They weren't disasters at all. They were corrections. Reality itself fighting back against human progress that threatened to punch holes through dimensional walls we didn't even know existed. Each catastrophe prevented something far worse. The complete unraveling of the physical laws that keep our universe stable. This knowledge sits in my mind like a cancer, growing and connecting seemingly unrelated events into patterns that keep me awake at night. I see now why those before me either went mad or disappeared into remote wilderness areas. Understanding the true scale of our reality, the delicate balance maintained by forces beyond human comprehension, makes everyday life feel like a thin veneer over an infinite abyss. Joseph's words about the time of return haunt me most. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a mathematical certainty. Humanity is approaching a technological threshold that threatens the very fabric of dimensional stability. The increasing frequency of Thunderbird sightings isn't a warning. It's a countdown. These beings, these guardians of reality itself, are gathering not to destroy us, but to restructure human consciousness on a fundamental level. They've done it before, guiding our evolution through carefully orchestrated extinctions and survivals. When I close my eyes, I see the equations that explain it all. How consciousness itself is a dimensional interface. How human minds were designed to perceive only a narrow band of reality to protect us from the truth. The cave systems aren't just ancient ruins. They're neural networks written in stone, processing reality itself through geometries that our mathematics is only beginning to comprehend. The government knows what's coming. Every major observatory has been documenting dimensional anomalies increasing exponentially since 2020. The storms aren't growing stronger. Reality itself is becoming less stable as humanity pushes against boundaries we were never meant to breach. The Thunderbird appearances aren't random. They're concentrated around research facilities, technological centers, anywhere human knowledge threatens to crack the shell of our dimensional egg. I understand now why those who glimpse this truth are allowed to survive. Why we're compelled to share our stories. We're not witnesses. We're antibodies, released into the bloodstream of human consciousness, preparing our species for an evolution we can't prevent or comprehend. The time of return isn't the return of the Thunderbirds. It's the return of humanity to a state of existence we've forgotten. A consciousness that can perceive and navigate multiple dimensions without shattering the delicate glass of reality. As I share this with you, I can feel the changes continuing within my mind. The hieroglyphs from the cave system appear in my dreams, teaching me a language that exists outside of time. And sometimes in the geometry of ordinary things, the spiral of water down a drain, the fractal patterns of frost on a window, I see messages left for those of us who have been chosen to understand. We are not the end of human evolution. We are the beginning of something our science could never predict or control. The markings appeared 3 days after I emerged from the cave system. At first, I thought they were bruises from my ordeal, dark, spiral patterns across my shoulders and down my spine. But they move. In the dark, they emit a faint bioluminescence that pulses in sync with electromagnetic disturbances in the atmosphere. When storm fronts approach, they rearrange themselves into warnings in that pre-linguistic script I first saw in the clouds. I've stopped seeing doctors after the third one committed suicide, trying to decode their meaning. Sleep has become a foreign country I can no longer visit during storms. The markings burn with mathematical certainty, pulling me from bed to witness things I wish I could forget. The Thunderbird isn't just above the clouds, it's woven into the fabric of the storm itself. Through my transformed eyes, I see how lightning isn't just electrical discharge, but neural impulses in a brain larger than our atmosphere. Every thunderclap carries messages in frequencies that restructure human consciousness on a molecular level. They found me, the others. Or perhaps we were drawn together by something that understands human connection better than we do ourselves. Dr. Chen's predecessor, alive but changed, tracking atmospheric anomalies through patterns in his own flesh. The Geological Survey team's sole survivor, her eyes now containing crystalline structures that record dimensional shifts. We share the same markings, the same burden, our very bodies transformed into living instruments measuring the approaching threshold. The countdown isn't marked in human time. It's written in the convergence of ancient prophecies, geological records, and astronomical alignments that our ancestors encoded into their most sacred texts. Every culture on Earth knew it was coming. This moment when humanity's technological acceleration would force an intervention from forces that maintain universal order. The Mayans weren't wrong about 2012. They just marked the beginning of a process that's reaching its crescendo now. What's coming isn't the end. It's a transformation so profound that our current consciousness can't perceive it without shattering. The Thunderbird appearances are increasing, not because they're gathering, but because reality itself is becoming thin enough for human minds to perceive what's always been there. The storms aren't growing stronger. Our dimensional barriers are growing weaker. Every technological advance, every scientific breakthrough brings us closer to a threshold that humanity was engineered to reach. I see it in my dreams now, the true shape of time, the purpose behind our species' desperate rush toward knowledge. We're not evolving naturally anymore. We're being shepherded towards something that our ancestors understood but couldn't explain. The cave paintings, the myths, the religions, they weren't trying to describe gods. They were trying to prepare us for what we're about to become. The markings on my skin tell me we have less time than I'd hoped. The others see it too, in the weather patterns, in the increasing frequency of dimensional anomalies, in the way electronic devices increasingly fail to function according to known physical laws. Reality itself is preparing for a metamorphosis, and humanity must either transform with it or face extinction. This isn't just another warning about environmental collapse or technological apocalypse. What's coming is written in mathematics older than organic life, in frequencies that predate sound, in geometries that existed before space and time. The Thunderbird isn't here to destroy us. It's here to midwife our species through a birth canal between dimensions. So I share this story not to frighten you, but to prepare you. When the storms come, and they will come, don't run. Don't hide. Look up. Let the lightning rewrite your consciousness. Let the thunder speak to the parts of your brain that remember when we were more than flesh, more than thought. The markings on my skin aren't a curse. They're an invitation to remember what humanity was always meant to become. The time of return isn't the return of ancient beings to our world. It's our return to what we were before we forgot. Creatures of lightning and storm, dancers between dimensions, children of something far vaster than our science could ever measure. The Thunderbird isn't our enemy, it's our future. And it's finally time for us to spread our own impossible wings. Sometimes in my darkest moments, I find myself longing for the comforting ignorance of my old life. I miss that arrogant certainty, the clean lines of a world defined by scientific papers and peer reviews. I miss being the man who could explain away mysteries with a graph or a footnote, who saw ancient wisdom as nothing more than primitive attempts to understand natural phenomena. But knowledge once gained can never be undone. The truth finds us all eventually, patient as the mountains themselves, inevitable as the storm. What I witnessed wasn't some oversized eagle that wandered off course, wasn't a misidentified aircraft playing tricks with light and shadow. The Thunderbird was a reminder, no, a warning, that our civilization is built on foundations far older and stranger than we dare imagine. We've constructed our cities and our sciences atop the sleeping bones of giants, and those giants, they're beginning to stir. I share this account not to convince you of its truth. Those who are meant to understand will feel it resonate in places deeper than reason, in parts of their minds that remember when we were something more than what we are now. I share it because I must, because the markings on my skin burn with the need to prepare others for what's coming. So the next time you hear thunder rolling across a cloudless sky, pay attention. When you see birds fleeing en masse from something your eyes can't perceive, remember these words. When you feel that primordial shiver dance along your spine, that ancient recognition encoded in your DNA, don't dismiss it. That's not your imagination. That's not anxiety or primitive fear. That's memory. That's recognition. Because they're coming back. The equations in my flesh, the hieroglyphs in my dreams, the patterns that write themselves in lightning across the night sky. They all tell the same story. The Thunderbirds are returning, and they remember us. They remember what we were before we forgot ourselves, before we traded dimensional awareness for technological progress. They remember what we're supposed to become. And they're here to remind us, whether we're ready or not.